I shall tell you what it smelled like first, because that is what nobody ever thinks to mention, and it matters rather more than one might suppose, because smell is the sense closest to memory, and this particular memory has been with me every day since. It smelled of roasted lamb and warm bread, of candle wax and cut flowers, white carnations in crystal vases on every table of the dining saloon. And underneath all of it, underneath the food and the perfume and the wool of 500 evening jackets, there was the faintest trace of fresh paint, because she was quite new. The RMS Titanic had been in service for precisely 4 days. My name is Margaret Ryerson. I am 37 years old, traveling with my family from Southampton back to New York, returning home after several months abroad. We are in first class. Stateroom B52, a room rather larger than most people's parlours in London, with a brass bed frame that does not creak, a writing desk with ivory handles on the drawers, and a private bathroom with hot running water, which in 1912 still carried something of the quality of a luxury one had not entirely earned. And all of this, I should remind you, was on a ship, in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean. The thing about the Titanic that is almost impossible to convey to someone who was not there is this: she did not feel like a ship. She felt like a very confident city that happened, almost incidentally, to be moving at 22 knots through an ocean that would kill you within minutes if you fell into it. That contradiction was quite invisible to us. We had all been rather carefully taught not to notice it. On the evening of Sunday, the 14th of April, 1912, I dine in the first-class saloon on D-deck. The room seats 500 people, and the ceiling rises 12 feet above our heads, coffered and plastered white in the manner of a Georgian dining room. The chairs are upholstered in white and gold. We eat 7 courses: turtle soup, poached salmon, filet mignon with truffle sauce, a dessert of peaches in chartreuse jelly. The wine costs more per bottle than most of the men who built this ship earned in a month. I am aware of this in the abstract way one is aware of such things in first class, and I eat the peaches regardless. After dinner, I walk the enclosed promenade on A-deck for perhaps half an hour. The cold beyond the glass is not the polite chill of an English April evening. It is rather more serious than that, the sort of cold that settles into the back of one's teeth and the space behind the eyes, and makes one understand, briefly but clearly, that one is very far indeed from land. But the sky beyond the glass is quite extraordinary. There is no moon that night, which means the stars are not scattered in the usual way, but packed. An absolute ceiling of light from one horizon to the other, every last star visible all the way down to where the sky meets the sea. And the sea itself is like black glass. No waves, no ripple, no white at all, simply a perfect dark mirror reflecting the stars above, so that standing there, one cannot properly distinguish where the ocean ends and the sky begins. It is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen, and I have the uneasy, inexplicable sensation of seeing it the way one sees something for the last time. I retire at 10:30 and fall asleep almost immediately. The engines hum their low, steady note through the mattress and the walls, a vibration so constant by now that it has become quite indistinguishable from silence. The way one stops hearing a clock that has been ticking in the same room for 4 days. The ship feels solid beneath me, permanent, rather like the sort of thing that simply does not end. I do not yet know that I am in the last hour of the world, as I have understood it. That everything I have just described, the warmth, the wine, the music drifting from the saloon, the glass-flat sea, will be gone in under 90 minutes. At 20 minutes to midnight, something happens in the dark, and nothing after that is ever quite the same again. I am almost asleep, not fully under, but in that soft, rather boneless place between waking and unconsciousness, where the mind has gone loose, but the body has not quite surrendered. The engines are humming beneath me, precisely as they have hummed every moment since Southampton, a deep and rhythmic pulse that by the fourth night has become as unremarkable as one's own breathing. I have entirely ceased to notice it, and then it stops, not loudly, not with any drama whatsoever. It simply stops, as quietly and completely as a held breath released in reverse. The hum that has been in my mattress, in my walls, in the soles of my feet, gone, all at once, in an instant. And the silence that follows wakes me the way no sound ever could, because the body understands, somewhere considerably below the level of conscious thought, that this particular silence is not right. I open my eyes. The cabin is dark, save for a thin line of light beneath the door. I lie quite still and listen to this new quiet, and somewhere deep in the body of the ship, a very great distance below my floor, and further still below that, I hear a sound, a grinding, not loud, not sharp, nothing one could fairly describe as violent, rather more like the sound of something very large being drawn at low speed across something equally large, a low, sustained rasp, like a fingernail dragged slowly along a wall, though scaled up to the dimensions of a ship and an iceberg. It lasts perhaps 7 seconds. Then it too ceases, and the silence that follows is absolute. What I wish you to understand about that moment is this. I am not frightened. I am puzzled. The two things feel quite different in the body, and what I feel is the mild, almost academic discomfort of something that does not quite make sense, rather than the cold electric shock of genuine alarm. I put on my dressing gown and open the cabin door. In the corridor, a steward is walking past at a brisk and thoroughly professional pace, carrying a stack of folded towels, as though it is the middle of the afternoon. He turns to me with a smile so practiced and so even that for a moment I almost accept it at face value. He tells me there is nothing whatsoever to concern myself with, that there has been a slight incident and the officers are attending to it, that everything is perfectly in hand. His voice is entirely steady. His manner is entirely steady. I thank him and close the door. I go to the porthole and look out into the darkness, and there, passing slowly alongside the ship, so close that had the glass been open, I might conceivably have reached out and touched it, is a wall of ice, white and massive and entirely silent, catching what little starlight filters down to it, already beginning to slide behind us, already past, already swallowed back into the dark as though it had never been there at all. On the forward deck below my porthole, I can see several passengers who have come out to look. Some of them have found chunks of ice that have broken off and scattered across the teak planking, and one gentleman in a dinner jacket is actually kicking one with the toe of his shoe in the manner of a schoolboy with a stone. Two ladies nearby are laughing. They are laughing because they do not know what I do not know, because none of us know yet that in the boiler rooms far below our feet, water is already flooding in through a seam in the hull, running for nearly 300 feet along the ship's side. A wound so long and so distributed that no single bulkhead can contain it. I return to bed, but I find I cannot sleep because the engines have not come back on. That is the thing that persists, lying there in the dark. Not the sound, not the ice, not the steward's rather too careful smile. The silence, the absence of that deep mechanical pulse that has been beneath everything for 4 days. Ships' engines do not fall quiet in the middle of the ocean for innocent reasons, and some part of me, the part that lives well below reassurance and good manners and the general desire not to make a scene, already knows this perfectly well. At around midnight, I hear the corridor filling with voices and footsteps, considerably more than there ought to be at this hour, moving with a purposefulness that is working rather hard not to sound like urgency. I get up and dress, deliberately, not in haste. I put on my warmest things, my heaviest coat, and lace my boots properly to the top. That decision I shall think about for the remainder of my life, because it will help to save it. I take my small bag, letters from my husband, a photograph of my children, a small amount of money. I cannot account for the instinct that makes me reach for those particular things. The body sometimes comprehends the shape of what is approaching before the mind is prepared to examine it directly. When I open the door this time, the corridor is an entirely different matter. Officers in uniform are moving quietly from cabin to cabin, knocking, speaking in low voices. Their faces carry that particular professional blankness that makes one more uneasy, not less. And I notice something I had not previously noticed, standing here in my boots on the corridor floor. The floor is not quite level. It slopes forward toward the bow by a degree, perhaps rather less than a degree, so subtly that one would miss it entirely were one not standing perfectly still and attending carefully. But I am standing perfectly still, and I am attending carefully. And the bow of this ship is lower than it was an hour ago. I close my cabin door behind me. I do not return to it. I follow the officers upward through the ship, staircase after staircase, and with each successive deck, the forward tilt becomes fractionally more pronounced beneath my feet, a degree becoming 2 degrees, still small, still the sort of thing one might persuade oneself not to notice, but quite undeniably there. By the time I push through the heavy door at the top of the staircase and step out onto the boat deck, the night air meets me like something rather more than cold. Out here, exposed, it is savage and immediate, below freezing and entirely aware of it. It finds the gap between one's collar and one's jaw, the hem of one's coat, and works its way through without the slightest apology. The deck is blazing with electric light, every lamp burning, every string of bulbs along the railings fully illuminated, the whole vast length of the boat deck thrown into sharp white relief against the black sky overhead. And gathered near the lifeboats, in clusters and small, bewildered groups, are perhaps 200 passengers. They are not panicking. That is the first thing one notices, and it is strange enough to stay with one. They are standing on the deck of a ship that is visibly angled forward, in the middle of the North Atlantic at midnight, and they are conducting themselves with the polite bewilderment of people at a dinner party that has taken an unexpected turn. Some are still in their evening clothes, ladies in long gowns with fur stoles drawn over their shoulders, gentlemen in dinner jackets and waistcoats. Some are holding drinks carried up from the smoking room, as though the glass in one's hand constitutes evidence that the ordinary world continues to exist. The older gentlemen especially, those who have crossed the Atlantic a dozen times, who consider themselves to know ships, are the most composed and the most mistaken. A lady standing beside me, well-dressed and well-spoken, draws her stole rather tighter and informs me that she has absolutely no intention of getting into a lifeboat. She has been assured, she says, on multiple occasions, that this vessel is unsinkable, and she would considerably rather remain on board than sit in a small open boat in the middle of the ocean in this cold, waiting for morning. Her reasoning is not in itself unsound. She is simply applying it to entirely the wrong situation. She is standing beside a wound in the ship's hull, already 300 feet in length, and she cannot see it, and nobody on this deck is going to tell her directly, because the officers have been instructed to keep the passengers calm, and calm is precisely what they are producing at the cost of the truth. The lifeboats are being uncovered. I watch the crew working the davits, the great iron mechanical arms that swing each boat out over the side of the ship to be lowered. And the first one swung out, lifeboat number 7, has a capacity of 65 persons. I count those being ushered toward it as it hangs over the black water 90 feet below, fewer than 30. Passengers are stepping back from the rail, shaking their heads. A lady says she must wait until her husband returns with his coat. A gentleman in a tuxedo moves away from the rail and informs the officer cheerfully that he shall catch the next one, his tone so entirely ordinary, so thoroughly Wednesday morning, that the officer does not argue with him. There is no next one for that gentleman. I know this now. I did not know it then. And then First Officer Murdoch turns to the group of ladies near me, perhaps 6 or 8 of us, strangers to one another, standing rather close together in the way one does in cold or in apprehension. And he says, with a patience so carefully maintained that the effort of it is visible about his eyes, "Ladies, please, into the boat, now." I go, not because I am particularly brave, and not because I have fully accepted what is happening, but because something in the precise and controlled flatness of his voice, the slight tightening about his eyes that he cannot quite suppress, tells me that if I do not go through this rail at this moment, the opportunity to do so will be gone. A crew member takes my arm to assist me over. His hands are not steady. I feel this through his gloved hands and through my coat sleeve, and I look at his face, and his face is that of a man who knows exactly how serious this is, and is doing everything in his power not to show it. The seat is hard and cold, the wood already damp and slick with the night air. The lifeboat swings out over the side of the ship on the davit arms, and I look down. The sea is 90 feet below, black and absolutely flat. And at this angle in the dark, it has the quality of looking down from the edge of the world. The ropes creak as we begin to descend. The pulleys clang and groan with the weight of us, and we go down slowly, level by level, past the illuminated portholes of each deck in turn. Through those portholes, I see faces. People on the other side of the glass, watching us descend. Some press their hands flat against the glass, as though reaching through it. Several of those faces belong to passengers in 3rd class, in the lower decks, who cannot reach the boat deck because the gates separating their section of the ship from the upper decks have been locked. I discover this later. I have not stopped thinking about it since. Halfway down, the lifeboat jams. It sticks for what feels like a full minute, swaying on its lines in the dark above the black water. The only sounds, the creak of the ropes, and a man's voice somewhere above us, shouting something one cannot make out. The lady beside me grips the gunwale with both hands so firmly that I hear her knuckles. Then the mechanism releases, and we continue downward, and the sea rises to meet us, and we strike the water, and the sound it makes is entirely wrong. Not a splash. The sea is so perfectly calm that the lifeboat comes down onto it with a flat, hard slap, rather like setting a tray down firmly on a stone floor. A sound that tells one immediately that the water beneath has no give whatsoever, that it is cold enough and still enough to have become something considerably closer to a solid surface than a liquid one. We shove off from the hull, and the oarsmen begin to row. There are 24 of us in a boat built for 65. I count. 24 persons in a boat with room for 65. launched from a ship carrying over 2,000, and this lifeboat is considered among the better loaded ones that night. That figure, the gap between 24 and 65, has not left me in all the years since. 37 empty seats that we are carrying out into the dark. The officer in charge is calling for us to row harder, to put distance between ourselves and the ship before she goes under, that the suction from a hull of this size could take a small boat down with her. I take hold of an oar and pull. My fingers inside my gloves are already going to the first stages of numbness. In this temperature, one loses feeling in the extremities within minutes. But I row regardless, because rowing is the only thing available to me. And then I turn and look back. I wish to describe this with some precision, because it is the image I have carried longest and most completely. The Titanic is still fully illuminated. Every porthole along her entire length is glowing warm yellow. Every deck lamp burning. Strings of electric lights running the full length of her railings, and all of it reflected in the black water beneath her, so that she appears to be floating between two layers of light, the stars above and her own reflection below. From 200 yards away on the flat, dark water, she is still the largest thing I have ever seen in my life. Longer than 4 city blocks laid end to end, her 3 vast funnels rising black against the stars. She does not look in the least like a ship that is sinking. She looks precisely like a ship illuminated for a very grand occasion, waiting for something to begin. But the bow is lower than it was. Not obviously so. One must look for it, must compare the angle of the deck against the line of the horizon. But it is there, a tilt so gradual and so certain that it carries the quality of something that has already decided and is simply being patient about carrying the matter through. And across the water, carried with perfect clarity across the absolute stillness of that windless night, traveling 200 yards of black glass as cleanly as though one were in the same room, I hear the band. They have come out from the first-class lounge onto the open deck, and they are playing. A waltz first, rather sweet and entirely absurd in the cold, then something slower and more considered, and then a hymn that several of the ladies in the boat recognize at precisely the same moment, because I see their faces change. The music comes to us across the water, and it is the most surreal thing I have ever heard. That ordinary, lovely sound, entirely unchanged, emanating from a place that is in the process of ceasing to exist. Several of the ladies in the boat are weeping, quietly, almost privately, turned slightly away from the others, as though grief were an imposition on company. A lady 2 seats behind me calls her husband's name toward the ship. Not loudly, not in any sort of distress, but steadily, at a perfectly conversational pitch, again and again, rather in the way one might call to someone in another room of one's house. She calls for a very long time. I watch the lights. I watch the portholes on the lower decks go dark one by one as the water rises and floods each compartment in turn, the ship consuming herself from the bow backward, the illuminated windows extinguishing from front to back in the manner of lights going out in an office building at the end of the working day. Each one that goes dark represents another compartment gone. The process is slow, and then slightly less slow. The hymn continues to reach us across the water. The cold has by this point moved well beyond discomfort into something altogether more serious. The air temperature is close to freezing, and the spray from the oars has begun to glaze on the gunwales and frost the lines. My feet inside my boots are no longer precisely feet in any useful sense, simply two heavy and rather distant things at the ends of my legs. The lady who came out in only her nightgown, no coat, no shoes, nothing whatsoever over her sleeping clothes, has ceased to shake as violently as she was, which I know enough to recognize as a poor sign rather than a good one. I unwrap my scarf and wind it about her hands and wrists, tying it as best I can with fingers that are not performing reliably, while someone else in the boat comes forward to help hold her steady. In the darkness around us, the shapes of other lifeboats appear and vanish. A shadow here, the sound of oars, a voice kept deliberately low. We are not alone on the water, but we are very small, and the ship behind us is very large, and there is nothing, absolutely nothing, that any of us can do but watch. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the Titanic is at an angle for which nothing in my experience had prepared me. A forward tilt so pronounced that the bow is entirely submerged, gone beneath the flat black water, while the stern is rising. Lifting slowly into the sky, the massive rear section of the ship climbing upward as the flooded bow pulls the front of her down. The whole vast structure rotating about its own midpoint in the manner of a lever pressed hard at one end. The three great bronze propellers, each one 15 feet across, each one the size of a substantial house, break the surface and hang in the air, dark and dripping, 40 feet above the waterline, faintly caught by the ship's own lights. It is a sight so entirely contrary to every expectation of what a ship is and does, that the mind genuinely struggles to process it. I watch it occur, and I do not fully credit it. And then the sounds begin. I shall try to describe what I heard, and I must ask you to understand that I am giving you the best account I can from a lifeboat 200 yards distant, in the dark, in a state of mind that was not quite ordinary consciousness. The sounds are not a single thing. They are a composition, several things occurring simultaneously, each distinct from the others. It begins as a deep, low roar from within the ship, not from the funnels or the outer deck, but from the interior of her, from her body, as though the ship has a stomach and the stomach is emptying. And what it is this. Everything inside the Titanic that is not welded or bolted to her structure, every grand piano in every first-class lounge, every mahogany sideboard, every china cabinet in the dining saloon, every iron boiler in the engine room, every steamer trunk in every stateroom, every crate and cask and hat box in the cargo hold, all of it is beginning to slide. The bow is descending rapidly now, the angle increasing, and 52,000 tons of ship is being tilted forward as though a table of extraordinary size were being overturned, and everything that had been resting on that table is now in motion. The sound of it reaches us across the water like sustained rolling thunder, a roar that builds and shifts and does not stop. And beneath that sound, beneath the roar of everything sliding, there is another sound, lower and more fundamental, the sort of sound one feels in the chest rather than hears with the ears. It is the sound of the ship's structure failing. The Titanic was engineered to float horizontally. Her keel, her ribs, her steel plates, every element of her construction assumed that the forces upon her would be the downward pressure of gravity, the lateral pressure of the sea, the forward thrust of the engines. Nobody designed her for this. The entire weight of her stern section cantilevered into the air, the entire weight of her flooded bow pulling downward, the midship section being required to do something that steel was never designed to do. and the sound of that steel refusing is the worst sound I have ever heard. Not a crack, not a bang, a sustained, grinding, metallic sound of considerable complexity, layered over a deeper groan. And it is the sound of something built to last a century, being destroyed in under a minute. At 18 minutes past 2 in the morning, the lights go out. All of them. Every porthole, every deck lamp, every string of electric lights along every railing, the great illuminated windows of the first-class lounge, the lit stairwells, every source of light on the ship extinguished simultaneously, as though a single switch has been thrown, the generators having finally failed. One moment, the Titanic is still ablaze with light across the dark water. The next, she is a black silhouette against the stars, darker than the sky itself, visible only as an absence. I must tell you something about those lights before I continue. The engineers of the Titanic, all 35 of them, had been at their stations in the boiler rooms and engine rooms since the ship struck the iceberg, 2 hours and 38 minutes earlier. They had been standing in compartments that were filling with water, maintaining the pumps and the generators. They kept the ship illuminated so that the evacuation could proceed in light rather than in darkness. Not one of them left his station. Not one of them was seen on deck. Not one of them survived. Every man who kept those lights burning died with the ship, and the moment the lights go out is the moment the last of them lost his battle. Then the darkness offers up two sounds in close succession. Two deep, heavy concussions, felt as much as heard, like two very large doors being slammed shut somewhere within the earth. The boilers, perhaps, or air pockets collapsing in the hull, or the keel itself finally giving way. And the Titanic breaks in half. The bow section tears away downward, pulls free of the stern, and plunges. The stern, freed in an instant of that enormous forward weight, swings upward, rises, continues to rise, until it is standing very nearly vertical against the night sky. A black tower against the stars. 90 degrees. The propellers 40 feet above the water. She holds that position for a moment that feels considerably longer than it is, perfectly vertical, as though gravity itself has paused to take stock of matters. And then she goes straight down, not at an angle, quite straight down, in the manner of a dropped object. The sea closes over her stern within seconds, and the sound is not the crash one might have imagined, but something quieter and considerably more final. A deep, hollow concussion as the ocean takes her back. And then, nothing. The water where she was for 2 hours and 40 minutes shows nothing but debris and darkness and 1,500 human beings. I must first tell you about the water temperature, because without that figure, nothing that follows can be properly understood. The North Atlantic, on the night of the 14th of April, 1912, is 28 degrees Fahrenheit. That is below the freezing point of fresh water. It is not, technically, frozen. Seawater, by virtue of its salt content, freezes at a marginally lower temperature. But at 28 degrees, it is cold enough to kill a healthy adult in under 30 minutes, and not through drowning. Through what happens to a body when it meets that temperature. When a person enters water that cold, the shock to the skin triggers an immediate and entirely uncontrollable response. A massive involuntary gasp, the lungs filling with whatever happens to be in front of the face. For those in the water that night, that means the North Atlantic. The heart simultaneously goes into spasm from the abrupt temperature change across the chest wall. cardiac arrest, entirely straightforward, in men and women who were perfectly healthy mere minutes before. The muscles begin to lock. The mind begins to fail. The body fights with everything it possesses, every available resource, for perhaps 10 minutes, perhaps 20 if the person is strong and the life jacket keeps the head sufficiently clear. And then the fighting stops. From our lifeboat, approximately 200 yards from where the Titanic went under, I hear everything that follows. I wish to be entirely clear about this. I am not recounting something related to me afterward, or read in a report, or seen in a motion picture. I am 200 yards distant, in an open boat, on a flat, calm sea, on a windless night, and I hear all of it. 1,500 voices. What it sounds like is not what one might suppose if one simply imagined a single person in extremis and multiplied the figure by 1,500. It is not like that at all. It is larger than that, and considerably more complex, and in certain respects more terrible precisely because of its complexity. It is the sound of 1,500 individual human beings, each undergoing their own particular version of the worst moment of their lives, and all of those sounds arriving simultaneously across 200 yards of still black water. A survivor named Lawrence Beasley, who wrote his account within weeks of the disaster, while the memory was entirely fresh, said that it contained every possible human emotion at once: fear and despair and agony and rage, and beneath all of it, something that sounded remarkably like infinite surprise, as though each person in that water could not quite bring themselves to accept, even then, that this was actually happening to them. As though somewhere within each of them, through the cold and the dark and the dying, there persisted a voice asking, "How is it possible that this is happening to me?" In our lifeboat, nobody speaks. We sit with our oars shipped and we listen, because there is nothing else available to us. Several people cover their ears. Others stare at the black water as though they might find something in it. A gentleman near the stern is weeping without producing any sound. I can see his shoulders in the dark, and I look away, because grief of that particular quality does not benefit from being witnessed. There is a debate in our boat about returning. It is brief, and it is dreadful, and I have thought about it on a very great number of occasions since. The officer in command says that if we row back toward the wreck site, those in the water will swamp us, that they will attempt to climb the sides, great numbers of them at once, and the weight will capsize us, and instead of some of us surviving, none of us will. He is not advancing this argument as a man seeking to preserve himself. He is advancing it as a man who has assessed the situation and believes himself to be correct. And he is very probably right. But I should like you to hold one figure in mind as I tell you this. Our lifeboat contains 37 empty seats. We launched with 24 persons in a boat for 65, and we are sitting on the water 200 yards from 1,500 people who are dying, and we have 37 empty seats, and we do not go back. Of the 20 lifeboats launched from the Titanic that night, only 2 returned to the wreck site in search of survivors. The first is Lifeboat 4, which had remained close to the ship. The second is Lifeboat 14, commanded by 5th Officer Harold Lowe, the only officer that night with the presence of mind and the basic human decency to transfer his passengers to other boats, assemble a volunteer crew, and row back into that sound. He goes back. He pulls 9 people from the water alive. 3 of them die shortly afterward from the cold. 9 survivors from 1,500 people in the water, because only 1 man among 20 boat commanders was prepared to go back. Our boat does not go back. I shall carry that for the remainder of my life. The screaming lasts approximately 15 to 20 minutes. I know this because I count silently, watching the second hand on my watch by what little starlight there is. I count because it is the only purposeful thing available to me, and because the only way I know to honor what I am hearing is to witness it fully, rather than turn away from it. I count 1 minute, and 2, and 5, and 10, and somewhere between 12 and 18 minutes, the sound begins to diminish. Not because anyone is being rescued, but because the cold has done in 28-degree water precisely what the cold does. And then it stops. Not gradually, not one voice at a time in the way a crowd disperses at the end of an evening. Almost entirely at once, the sound is simply gone, as though someone has closed a very large and very heavy door somewhere in the dark. The silence that follows is the most substantial thing I have ever experienced. It has weight. It has a kind of texture. It presses against the ears in a physical manner. It is a silence composed of 1,500 people who are no longer cold, no longer afraid, no longer anything at all. And in that silence, our small boat sits on the black water, and nobody speaks, and there is nothing to say, and we wait. The sea around us in every direction is covered with wreckage, extending as far as one can see in the faint starlight. Deck chairs from the first-class promenade, floating with their cushions still attached. A wooden door from somewhere within the ship. A steamer trunk split open at the locks, its contents, shirts still folded, a lady's dress, letters in their envelopes, spreading across the water in a slowly widening circle. A wine bottle, still corked and sealed with wax, floating perfectly upright, as though awaiting the attention of a sommelier at a table that no longer exists. Small objects in every direction, the accumulated possessions of 2,000 people, dispersed across the surface of the Atlantic, rather like the effects of a civilization that has simply ceased. And there are bodies. There are bodies in the water in every direction one looks, and one finds one cannot look away. They are all wearing life jackets, and the life jackets hold them vertical. They are not lying flat on the surface, as one might have imagined, but floating upright, as though standing in water simply too deep for their feet to find the bottom. Faces above the surface, eyes open. Some with expressions of considerable effort still about them. Some entirely still. Some with their mouths open, as though they died in the middle of a sentence. I make every effort not to look at them directly. I find I cannot look away. I keep persuading myself I have seen movement. I keep persuading myself I recognize someone. A lady at the forward end of the boat is holding a child, a little girl, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, wrapped entirely inside her mother's coat, with only the top of her dark head visible above the collar. The lady does not look at the water, or the wreckage, or any of us. She holds the child against her chest with both arms, and directs her gaze at some point in the middle distance that only she can see. And she breathes, slowly, steadily, with great deliberateness, as though she has assigned herself the single task of continuing to breathe, and intends to execute it with complete attention. Somewhere behind me, someone is praying, not loudly, and with no quality of performance whatsoever, simply a very quiet voice, saying words that were evidently learned early in life. words residing in that part of the mind that continues to function when everything else has gone rather numb. The words coming in a low and steady murmur, like water moving over stones. I attempt to recall those words. I believe I know them, or once did. I cannot locate them. The cold has long since passed entirely through pain and arrived somewhere considerably beyond it, a place that bears a superficial resemblance to calm, but is not calm at all. My feet inside my boots have ceased to be feet in any practical sense. The skin of my face stopped producing sensation some time ago, which is rather more alarming than the pain was. I clench and unclench my hands inside my gloves at regular intervals to maintain circulation. Several others in the boat are doing the same, and in the silence, the small sounds of this, the shifting, the controlled breathing, the deliberate and repeated movement, become the only sounds in existence. At some point, a lady near me begins to sing, very softly, almost privately, a hymn, one whose words I know perfectly well, but find I cannot name if asked. Two other voices join hers, tentatively, barely above a whisper. They sing perhaps 2 verses. Then they stop. The silence out here is too large and too serious to admit of singing, and I believe all 3 of them feel this at precisely the same moment, that any sound at all is somehow inadequate to the scale of what has occurred, and that silence is the more appropriate tribute. The hours after the ship goes under are the longest I have ever experienced, and they possess a quality for which I have no adequate word. Not simply fear. Fear is too elementary, too forward-looking, too concerned with a specific object. What I experience in those hours is something more resembling suspension, an inability to form any belief in the future. The mind keeps sliding away from the concept of tomorrow, of New York, of one's family, of any world beyond this particular section of cold black water, and these particular stars, and this particular silence. Time passes. I know it passes because the stars move, because my watch ticks, because the cold deepens slightly. But the hours have no shape. They are simply duration, formless and very long. At some point during those shapeless, dark hours, I become aware of a new variety of fear, quieter than what came before, and in certain respects considerably worse. Not a fear of the water, not the fear of dying quickly and dramatically, which one has already faced and moved through. The fear that morning will come and the horizon will be empty, that we will still be here, that we shall go on floating on this flat black sea until we too go quiet and join those standing upright in the water around us, and nobody comes. That is the fear that settles into one in those hours and will not be shifted, the fear of simply never being found. At approximately 3:30 in the morning, 1 hour and 10 minutes after the Titanic went under, though it feels a very great deal longer than that, a lady at the forward end of the boat makes a sound that is somewhere between a gasp and a word, and points at something on the horizon. I look where she is pointing. A light, far away, further than one can reliably judge distance across open water in the dark, but steady and entirely real, and quite clearly not a star. A light at the horizon that holds its position while the stars continue their slow movement overhead. Then, beside it, another, and then, arcing up from somewhere below that horizon into the black sky, a rocket, a flare burning white and brilliant as it climbs and then falls, and it has not come from any of our boats. It has been fired by someone approaching us. The RMS Carpathia. She was 58 miles distant when the Titanic transmitted her distress signal. Her captain, Arthur Rostron, was asleep in his quarters when his wireless operator knocked at his door. He was dressed and on the bridge within minutes. What he proceeded to do over the following 3.5 hours represents one of the quieter acts of courage in the entire history of this disaster. Quiet because he made no speeches and left no dramatic account of it, and because he had absolutely no guarantee that anyone remained alive, and he came regardless. He shut off heating to every passenger cabin on the Carpathia to redirect steam pressure to the engines. He ordered every ship's doctor to establish emergency stations. He ordered every blanket aboard to be collected and made ready. He posted additional lookouts at the bow and on the bridge wings, and he drove his vessel to 17 knots, well in excess of her rated capacity, through the same iceberg field that had just destroyed us, in the dark, without reducing speed, threading between mountains of ice by starlight and nerve, and an absolute refusal to stop. He was doing all of this on the possibility that somewhere on the water ahead of him, someone was still there to be found. When I see that light on the horizon, I produce a sound I have never produced before that moment and have not produced since. I have no name for it. It is not a word, and it is not precisely a scream. It is somewhere between the two, originating from somewhere considerably below language. Every other person in the boat produces very nearly the same sound within moments of one another, as though it is communicable, as though the sight of that light crosses every individual threshold at almost exactly the same instant. And then everyone is weeping, not in the quiet and controlled manner in which one had been conducting oneself through the dark hours, not with any pretense of composure, but in the entirely unmanaged way that one weeps when one has relinquished belief in something and it becomes real again without warning, when the mind finally catches up to what the body has already understood. The Carpathia fires rockets as she approaches, evenly spaced, each one communicating across the water what cannot be said in words. I see you. I am coming. Stay where you are. Hold on. Each rocket is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. She reaches the first lifeboats at 4 o'clock in the morning. Getting aboard proves harder than one had anticipated, and I find myself thinking about this afterwards, that the most physically demanding thing I did that entire night was the very last thing at the moment of greatest exhaustion, greatest cold, greatest incapacity. A rope ladder is thrown down the ship's side from approximately 50 feet above us. My hands, after 5.5 hours in sub-freezing air, are barely functional. I can close them, just, but the grip they produce is not one to be relied upon. I climb using my forearms, my wrists, my elbows, hooking the rungs rather than gripping them properly, pulling myself upward, rung by rung, while the ladder swings against the hull. There are people below me waiting. There are people above me reaching down. At the top, 2 crew members take hold of my arms and draw me over the rail onto the deck. Someone places a blanket about my shoulders before I have fully straightened up. Someone else puts a tin cup into my hands. Not soup, simply plain salted broth, steaming, and I hold it against my face for some time before I drink it, because the warmth against my skin is what I require before anything else in the world, before the liquid, before anything. Simply that. Warmth from a tin cup held against one's face on the deck of a ship that ought not, by any reasonable reckoning, to have been there. I sit down on the deck, because standing is no longer something I am able to manage. I watch the other lifeboats come alongside, one by one, as the sky begins, very slowly and almost imperceptibly, to lighten in the east. The rescue continues until 9:15 in the morning, 4.5 hours to bring in every lifeboat, every survivor. When the final count is made, the number is 712. 712 survivors from 2,224 persons aboard. 1,512 are dead. I remain on the deck of the Carpathia considerably longer than I ought. My legs have carried me this far, over the rail, up the ladder, across the deck to this spot at the rail, and now they seem to have reached some private arrangement to stop. So I stand here, and I hold the rail with both hands, and the grey dawn comes up over the North Atlantic. It is not a dramatic sky, not the kind of sky that would suit what has happened. Simply grey and flat and cold and gradually lighter, the way mornings are when they have no interest whatsoever in being beautiful. The dark retreats, slowly and without ceremony, and what it leaves behind it is this, the water. I wish to tell you what the water looks like in that first grey light, because I have been asked many times in the years since that morning, and I have never found words that fully answer the question. What I can tell you is this. The surface of the North Atlantic, on the morning of the 15th of April, 1912, looks precisely like the aftermath of a life interrupted in the middle of a sentence. A deck chair drifts past with its cushions still tied on, still perfectly arranged, as though someone has stepped away from it momentarily and fully intends to return. A lady's hat box, intact and sealed, turns slowly in the current, going nowhere in particular. A man's evening coat spread flat upon the water, the tails fanned out behind it. A child's woolen glove, very small, the kind one buttons at the wrist. The small, ordinary wreckage of 2,000 interrupted lives, dispersing across the surface of the Atlantic in every direction one looks. And among all of it, everywhere, the bodies. They are still in their life jackets, still upright, exactly as they were when the screaming ceased an hour and a half ago. Faces turned up toward the lightening sky. The life jackets hold them with a terrible fidelity, keeping them vertical, keeping them at the surface, so that they do not lie flat upon the water, as one might have imagined, but stand, as though they are simply standing in water that is rather deeper than expected, as though they are waiting, with considerable patience, for something that is taking rather longer than anticipated to arrive. And then the Carpathia begins to move. I feel it before I see it, the faint vibration through the rail, the almost imperceptible change in the water alongside the hull as the engines engage. She is turning. She is preparing to leave. And she does not stop for them. I want you to understand what I am watching. The Carpathia moves through the debris field and through the bodies at a slow and careful speed, her hull passing within yards of people who appeared on the Titanic's passenger list 2 nights ago, people who dined in the same saloon, who promenaded the same deck. The ship passes them and does not stop. A body turns slowly in the wake as we go by. Another rocks gently and then is still again. And I understand, standing here with my hands on the cold iron of the rail, that the living have been collected, that this is what we are, the collected ones, and that the dead are being left to the Atlantic. The sea will keep them. I think about the gentleman in the dinner jacket, the one who stepped back from the rail at lifeboat number 7 and said, in that perfectly ordinary voice, that he would catch the next one. I look at the faces in the water as we pass through them, and I find I cannot make myself look with sufficient care to find him. I permit myself that particular cowardice. There are certain things one does not need to know precisely. I think about the faces at the portholes as we were lowered, the hands pressed flat against the glass from the other side. I knew even then, in the lifeboat, that something was wrong about those faces, that it was not the gesture of people watching a spectacle, but of people who had run out of other options entirely. On the Carpathia, in the hours after boarding, I learned the full truth of it from other survivors. The gates separating the lower decks from the boat deck were locked during the evacuation. For a great many of the people on that ship, the distance between where they were and where the lifeboats were was not a question of stairs and corridors. It was something considerably more permanent than that. I do not say any of this aloud. There is nobody to say it to, and in any case, I do not yet possess the right arrangement of words. What I have instead is the image of hands pressed flat against glass from the inside, and the knowledge of what those hands could not reach. And I suspect those two things will occupy a considerable portion of whatever remains of my life. The crossing to New York takes 3 days. I shall not attempt to describe them in any detail, because I am not entirely certain I was present for them in any meaningful sense. Some essential part of me had remained on the water, in the lifeboat, in the dark, and could not be persuaded to follow the rest of me onto the Carpathia. I am not certain it has fully made that crossing even now. On the evening of the 18th of April, the Carpathia docks in New York. My family is on the pier. I see my husband before he sees me, and I have a moment of simply looking at his face, a face I have known for 15 years, which looks in this particular moment more necessary than anything I have ever seen. I find I am quite unable to produce any sound whatsoever. He sees me. He comes forward. He puts his arms around me without a word, and I hold him and do not let go for rather a long time, and he holds me and asks nothing at all. That silence, the silence of a person who has understood that questions would be entirely the wrong thing, is, I think, the single kindest thing anyone has ever done for me. That night I lie in a room that does not move. I want you to understand that this is not a small thing, though it sounds like one. For 4 days the Titanic was beneath me, and then for 3 days the Carpathia, and in both cases there was a pulse beneath the floor, that deep, low, constant vibration of engines working far below, the feeling of being carried by something larger than oneself. I had entirely ceased to notice it, and now it is gone, and the floor is simply a floor, and the building stands on solid ground that goes nowhere and intends to go nowhere, and the stillness is so complete and so strange that I lie quite awake for a very long time, simply feeling the absence of it. In this still room, in this still bed, it feels rather like a particular variety of bereavement. I think about the engineers, all 35 of them. I think about what it cost them to maintain their stations in the flooding boiler rooms and keep the generators turning and the lights burning for 2 hours and 38 minutes after the iceberg struck, so that the rest of us might see to load the lifeboats. I did not know their names when I was on that ship. I have learned some of them since. I find that knowing the names matters to me, though I could not easily account for why. Perhaps because a name is the smallest possible unit of a person. Perhaps because to know a name is to refuse, in some very small and quite insufficient way, to let the water have absolutely everything. In the weeks that follow, I learned something else. The bodies were not recovered that morning. The Carpathia left them where they were and sailed for New York, because her purpose was the living, and the living had been collected. 4 days after the sinking, a cable ship called the C.S. Mackay Bennett was chartered from Halifax and sent out specifically to recover the dead. She found them still there, hundreds of bodies, still upright in their life jackets, still facing the sky, 4 days on the open Atlantic. The Mackay Bennett recovered 306 of them. She ran out of embalming supplies. She ran out of space. Decisions were made out there on the water about which bodies to bring home and which to commit to the sea. Those decisions were made in large part on the basis of what class of ticket the dead had been traveling on. The identified wealthy were preserved and returned. The rest were buried at sea, in the water that had already taken them once. I have thought about those decisions on a very great number of occasions. I think about the hands at the portholes. I think about the locked gates. I think about what it means to have been on the right side of those decisions, entirely by accident of circumstance. To have been in first class, to have had the heavy coat, to have been handed over the rail by an officer whose hands were not steady, to have rowed away and not gone back, to have been simply in the wrong place to die. That is not a comfortable thing to know about oneself. It does not resolve into something one can set down. It sits within one, year after year, entirely unchanged. People expect survivors to feel grateful, and I am grateful. I want to be entirely clear about that, because the gratitude is real and enormous and has not left me for a single day. But nobody warns one about what comes to reside alongside gratitude when it is born of something like this. Nobody tells one that every morning for the remainder of one's life, before one is properly conscious, before the day has properly begun, the first thought to arrive will be, why me? Not with any quality of joy, simply with weight. The Titanic sank in 2 hours and 40 minutes. In that time, everything that had seemed permanent proved not to be. The largest ship ever built, the unsinkable ship, the ship where the collision was so gentle that drinks did not spill and people kicked ice about the deck and laughed. The ship that felt, on that last evening, precisely like the sort of thing that simply does not end. I have spent the years since attempting to comprehend what one does with that, with the knowledge that certainty is a story one tells oneself in order to make the world feel navigable, that the most dangerous moment is invariably the one in which everything feels entirely solid, when the engines are humming their steady note beneath one's feet, when the stars are out, and the sea is flat, and the food is good, and the company is agreeable, and there is no conceivable reason to suppose that any of it is about to change. One cannot imagine it. Sitting in that dining saloon on the last evening, the candlelight, the warmth, the smell of roasted lamb, the low hum of the engines beneath the floor, I could not imagine it. Not one of us at that table could. And that, I have come to understand, is not a failure of intelligence or of character. It is simply what it is to be alive before the thing happens. I was there on the last perfect night. I was there when the engines stopped. I was there when the Carpathia moved through the dead and did not stop. And I was there when the sun finally came up over the North Atlantic on the morning of the 15th of April, 1912, and lit a sea that was empty and cold and still as glass.